Okay, well, I think it's fair to say, and not particularly original to think, but when we think about the scientific and technological legacies of the First World War, what comes to mind first are mechanical weapons on the front lines and the chemical gases, the enduring images of machines, gases, and unprecedented levels of slaughter and suffering. I think it's understandable that those would be the first images that come to mind when we think about the legacies of the First World War. But as a historian of science interested in institutions and relationship between science and the state, there is a lot more that historians of science, I think, should be interested in when it comes to the First World War, and indeed are getting interested in increasingly, I think, as the next 4 years will unfold. So this paper is not going to be anything about the battlefront. It's going to be solely about what's happening on the home front, where we find developments in the organisation and the management of scientific and engineering research that have important legacies for both the history of the British state and for the history of science and technology into the 20th century. Now, this paper is about one body that had a particularly important role to play in the governance of science and engineering on the home front, the Board of Invention and Research, or the BIR for short. The BIR is often alluded to in histories of early 20th century science, but has only received attention in 2 short pieces. In a 1971 article, Roy McLeod and Kay Andrews provide a detailed account of the work that the board is best remembered for, which was researching, manufacturing and testing a series of hydrophones for detecting submarines. While the second piece, also from the 1970s, is to be found in an edited volume and provides really just an overview of what the BIR did during the war and how it came to an end in 1917. So I'm going to try not to talk too much about what the BIR worked on in terms of specific inventions and research projects. And instead I'm going to examine the board's cultures of scientific governance as they slowly shifted through the board's internal transformations, its interactions with existing Admiralty technical departments, and the expansion of state infrastructure for invention and research at this time. The BIR has a short history of just 2 years. It's abolished in 1917. But during this time, its members asked a series of really important questions concerning scientific governance. They asked, how should invention be assessed and research encouraged by the state? What facilities should its members use in doing this kind of work? And were the existing laboratories and experimental institutions that the state had sufficient to achieve these objectives? In a way, the BIR is more than just a board of scientists and naval officers. It's really a hub in the organisation of government, academic and occasionally commercial laboratories. Moreover, if we look beyond the BIR, past 1917, we can better understand the legacy that this institution has on institutionalised scientific and engineering research in Britain. So, to give you some background details, the BIR is formed in 1915 in July, specifically to screen, govern and promote popular invention, meaning the thousands of proposals that were sent to the Navy every day for new devices and weapons. By July 1917, the BIR had received 41,127 submissions. That works out at 790 submissions a week, and assuming post 6 days a week, 32 submissions to deal with every day. Suggestions ranged from barrage balloons to repel zeppelins to, quote, a bad smell that a cleaner had found whilst doing her work and believed it could be bottled up and used against the Germans. The number of inventions submitted to the BIR that were taken up and taken further was quite small, but in the process of investigating these inventions, the scientists and engineers on the BIR undertook a large amount of self-directed research. The BIR funded the investigations of physicists, chemists, engineers and naval officers in a range of military, public and university laboratories. The order establishing the BIR gave its members responsibility for organising and encouraging the scientific effort in relation to the requirements of the naval service. It continued, the question of turning the scientific and inventive powers of the country to their best use is one of great importance. There are two quite separate ends to be kept in view. The first is the sift invention, and the second is to promote them. By the end of 1917, the BIR had charged over £40,000 in research expenses alone, and were predicting £55,000 by the end of the first quarter of 1918. This may seem small in comparison to today's HRC projects, but to put this figure in some context, the annual grant that was administered by the Royal Society from the government for scientific research in 1919 stood at £5,000 a year. So what the BIR is spending is considerable at this time. Now, it's quite easy to look back at the Great War and expect this type of combination of scientific research, invention, and the military to emerge. But I want to start by kind of asking some questions about this. So, the predominant view of historians of science is that war has a ratchet effect on scientific research. In an often quoted remark on the eve of the Great War, the American astronomer George Ellery Hale told President Woodrow Wilson that war should mean research. John Agar has recently noted in his overview of science in the 20th century that historians agree that the First World War accelerated a trend towards increased organisation in the modern world, including the institutionalisation of planned research. Now, this ratcheting effect has dominated the historiography of science and war in the 20th century, and the work of the BIR, although not really properly examined, is often alluded to as an example of this ratcheting effect. Now, wars do always seem to involve a certain degree of profiteering and opportunism. In the 19th century, the Navy was more receptive to proposals from inventors during times of war. But what we see in the BIR in terms of governing the invention and the research was unusual. It certainly wasn't the case in either the 1850s or later during the Boer War that the respective governments of the day brought together the nation's leading physicists, chemists, and engineers together in a standing committee and permanent boards that examined and promoted invention. So cultures of scientific governance are products of their time and have to be constructed. So what we see during the First World War shouldn't be taken lightly. It has an interesting history. To bring this into focus, I want to briefly outline one of the arguments against what the BIR was doing and the increased promotion of scientific research and development in the Navy. Writing in 1930, this individual, Bernard Ackworth, was a captain in the Royal Navy and an author of popular ornithology books. And in a 1930s book, The Navy of Today and Tomorrow, he remembers a time when there was no scientific establishment within the Navy, and invention was left to the practitioners of particular crafts. Writing under the auspices of an average sailor, he wrote that hulls, machinery, instruments, devices, weapons, explosives, gas, aircraft, sea lines, not actually a funny story, that's quite interesting, hydrophones, all of these show the cloven hoof of scientific research, represented by a huge bureaucratic department presided over by the usual director and administrative staff. So Ackworth saw no reason why science and engineering should become military business. His position was partly based on a reading of history, looking at what the Royal Navy had done up until the First World War. Prior to 1900, the government and the naval services had only tended to turn to scientists to undertake specific tasks in the main, mapping the globe, solving problems of navigation, and building instruments to assist the work of naval officers. But by 1930, things had changed. The Navy now utilised the knowledge and skills of scientists in a range of areas, from oceanography and ship design to intelligence and naval training. There was even a dedicated branch of the Navy for scientific research, for which Ackworth was especially dismayed. To speak and think of scientific research with an awe bordering on reverence is the present vogue, he thought. To criticise it adversely is regarded as something akin to impertinence. To ridicule it as a modern superstition is blasphemy. Scientific research has in fact become a creed. So Ackworth's critique of the changing relationship between science and the state in the 20th century is well taken when we consider the place of scientists and engineers in the 19th century state. There have been very few permanent positions in the naval bureaucracy held by scientists. The second half of the century saw important shifts in the authority of expert knowledge, but the power structures in which scientists and engineers worked remained largely consultative and, more importantly, invitational. So when scientists were involved in Admiralty work, it was because they'd been called or invited to offer their opinion. Unless they were called to offer opinion, they didn't have the voice within the Navy to have their opinion heard. Now, the Great War and the Board of Invention Research does provide a change to this in producing a standing body where scientists and engineers are employed. And this provided an opportunity for scientists and inventors to take a new role for themselves within the state. Yet the notion that the Navy should turn to scientists and engineers to find new ways of waging war was no more inevitable than the way in which it did happen during the First World War was predictable. Ackworth's argument that the cloven hoof of scientific research had infiltrated areas of government and public service that had never before had a pronounced scientific dimension, I think invites us to better understand the connections between science and military that were formed during the Great War and what they left after the Great War. So to provide a bit more of context, the decades around the turn of the 20th century have been marked by a number of new departures in the relationship between science and the state in Britain in terms of institution buildings. We have the opening of the National Physical Laboratory in 1902, the formation of the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research in 1915, and a small handful of experimental stations, such as the Admiralty's experimental works at Hassler for hydrodynamic experiments, that are formed just before the start of the 19th century. The 20th century. In simple terms, these institutions marked a shift away from the Victorian culture where specific departments of the state called on the expertise of scientists and engineers in an ad hoc manner, via private social networks, the handful of scientists in government posts, or more often than not, as I mentioned, through government committee work. The establishment of these new state research laboratories and bodies meant that an increasing number of researchers were employed by the state departments dedicated to specific scientific and engineering projects. So as well as being a consumer of expertise, the state increasingly becomes a producer of it too. And the addition of the BIR in 1915 as a standing body that examined technical questions extended the tentacles of organised research further into both the state and the scientific community. But the BIR doesn't easily fit into this picture, as I'm going to talk about, nor does it provide a straightforward evidence of the ratchet effect of war on scientific research. Initially, promoting the research of scientists was not on the agenda. In its conception, the BIR was really a political entity with a political purpose that it had to play. It had to silence accusations that the government was neglecting invention in its war effort. So, from the outbreak of war, there's a campaign in the press for the government to form a bureau for coordinating the inventive capacity of the country, as people like H.G. Wells put it. This was part of a larger criticism of Britain's war of material, that it was less organised than the German counterpart. Writing in the Times, H.G. Wells insisted that the British approach to science and engineering in war was conservative, imitative, and amateurish, and was, quote, likely to go on that way until we create some supplementary directory force, some council in which the creative factors in our national life, and particularly our scientific men and our younger scientific soldiers and engineers and sailors, have a fuller representation. What Wells primarily wanted was a means to screen and foster invention, in the belief that out of the 40,000 people sending suggestions to the government, there'd be some in there which would be worthy of merit and worth looking at. The BIR was, in a short-handed way, the government's response. The formation of the BIR also was inculcated in contemporary naval politics. So following the failed Dardanelles campaign, the new First Lord of the Admiralty, Arthur Balfour, reorganised the Navy's war effort and moved a number of key personnel. The First Sea Lord Admiral Jackie Fisher resigned, publicly citing his outrage at how the former First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, had conducted himself in preparing the Dardanelles campaign. Fisher took his criticism to Andrew Bonar Law, leader in the opposition, and in the coalition reshuffle of Herbert Asquith's government, Churchill was replaced by Balfour. Balfour was a noted philosopher and a member of the Royal Society. Fisher, in contrast, didn't get kicked out of the Admiralty like Churchill, but instead was offered a new position as the president of the BIR. Now, Fisher was a very well-known figure in Edwardian Britain. He first found notoriety in his actions in the bombardment of Alexandria in 1882, and later became a fervent advocate of technological reforms in the Navy. He was the driving force behind the dreadnought battleships that dominated naval politics in the years preceding the First World War. He also introduced submarines into British naval policy. Fisher was a charismatic public figure, and he was supported by many of Britain's leading journalists, like W.T. Stead. He also headed up a group of naval officers who were particularly interested in the way in which technology was really the basis for naval power, as opposed to, say, individual courage or acts of valour, a more traditional sense in the Navy of what naval power was about. This group that supported Fisher was known as the Fish Pond, and included people like Charles Madden, who commanded the torpedo school at HMS Vernon, Percy Scott, a gunnery specialist, and Henry Jackson, who served on the Vernon prior to moving into wireless telegraphy. On the 6th of June 1915, Churchill wrote to Asquith to criticise Fisher's appointment as president of the BIR. On the 8th of July, he received a response from the new First Lord seeking to placate him. He said, "You have so often spoken to me of Fisher's great gifts as an inventor, and as well as his general originality of mind and consuming energies. These surely are qualities too valuable at such a time as this to be thrown away." Balfour went on to reassure Churchill that he would never be forgiven and would never be given a position back in the Board of Admiralty. But Churchill was unmoved and made the argument that Fisher commanded great loyalty within only a section of the Admiralty, and that putting him in charge of the BIR would potentially split the Admiralty between those who supported him and those who opposed him. And that does become a factor, as we'll see. So, Fisher was given the presidency of the BIR, and he was assisted by a central committee that included the physicist J.J. Thomson, the chemist George Belby, and the engineer Charles Parsons. They also had a naval officer, Vice Admiral Richard Pearce, on the central committee as the naval representative. They met on a weekly basis to make decisions about what research and inventions would receive BIR support, how much money would be allocated to that work, and whether it should require the attention of any of the BIR's members, which was quite the roster of scientific and engineering talent. The Central Committee quickly decided that the subcommittees would have, quote, full authority to allocate their experimental work at the discretion of various laboratories, scientific bodies, or scientists. The Central Committee would, however, be required to sanction these decisions. The only instance when the Central Committee was going to make a decision by itself was if the President wanted to undertake kind of commission research in a particular area, costing no more than 200 shillings. Early work sanctioned by the Central Committee in this way included Ernest Rutherford's experiments on ways of collecting sound from water, William Bragg's study of water-piercing shells for destroying submarines, and Charles Mertz's investigations into controlling the vertical path of submarines by means of water jets. The BIR also featured a consulting board that included the talents of William Crookes, Oliver Lodge, Ernest Rutherford, William Bragg, Lord Raleigh, Gerald Stoney, and Bertrand Hopkins. These scientists and engineers were not paid for their work. This was all voluntary. But their research expenses were covered and materials were provided. Yet still, in the first year of its work, the BIR depended a lot on the goodwill of its members and who their members knew who could undertake experiments. The full membership of this consulting board consisted of the members of the BIR's 6 subcommittees, which were focused on particular areas, from airship and aircraft design to anti-submarine devices, naval construction, and land tanks, land ironclads, explosives, projectiles, gas warfare, and aircraft ammunition. Now, how is this board supposed to work in practice? I really like this cartoon, this Hazelden cartoon from the Daily Mirror, showing the seated Fisher hearing strange invention ideas from a group of very caricatured inventor figures. But unfortunately, this was never likely to happen in the BIR's offices. The BIR weeded out the majority of its inventions before they ever got to the Central Committee. They were weeded out by secretaries and by the subcommittees. So when the BIR received a letter suggesting an invention or a line of research, it was registered, numbered, and delivered to the secretary, Captain Crease. He made the first judgment on the letter's contents, deciding whether to redirect it to one of the subcommittees or reply to the sender with an acknowledgement that the BIR would not take up the suggestion. To quote from the procedural document, if the letter is obviously from a lunatic or contains some ridiculous proposals which have been examined before, it is answered at once and no further action is taken. The other scenarios were that a sender would suggest or promise an invention but not disclose any details until they were remunerated with money. These were often handled with quite delicate care and often rejected without too much consideration. Another case was that an inventor from America or Canada requested travel expenses so he could present his idea in person, and depending on how the credibility of the individual was judged, that could sometimes happen. So if the secretary wanted to give a letter further consideration, it was entered onto an index card and a short description of its work was recorded. It was then passed to an assistant secretary on the relevant section or subcommittee who would assess the proposal in detail. He would consult with the, quote, Admiralty experts on the particular subject wherever possible, meaning the members of the consultative committee. The number of proposals was again whittled down at this stage. If the assistant secretary still found some value in a proposal, it was passed on to all the members of that section subcommittee. At this point, the decision to investigate or reject a proposal came under the attention of scientists and engineers. If they wanted to continue with a suggestion, the matter was taken up by the Central Committee, where Fisher and others acted on the advice of the subcommittees, and it was at that point that a financial commitment was to be made, depending on the subcommittee's advice. Here's a sample of a submission document. This is a file for Harry Grindle Matthews, a particularly interesting inventor, the inventor of the death ray and other well-known devices. This was his proposal to control the direction of torpedoes with selenium, which the Admiralty did fund for 2 years, putting extensive resources into this one. You can see from the top that the document has been sent to the 3rd Sea Lord, who is in charge of naval material, and you can also see who the document's being referred to down the left-hand column. And this one, as I mentioned, went quite far in the Admiralty. Now, with a sense of what the BIR did, or at least how Balfour envisioned it working, I want to use the rest of my time to focus on the shifting cultures of governance in the BIR and looked at how it slipped from assessing inventions to undertaking research. One of the key ways in which the slip happened is, I think, to be found in Fisher's particular managerial style as the president of this board. He was a particularly energetic force on the board. He renamed the building in Cockspur Street where the BIR met Victory House, and wrote with Wellesian zeal about the role of invention in the war effort. On the 5th of July 1915, he wrote to Balfour, "This war is going to be won by many inventions. 11 months of war have shown us simply as servile copyists of the Germans. Many inventions must be fostered. Fisher brought this zeal to the BIR, telling the first meeting that the members must hustle. He also cited Admiral Nelson as a source of inspiration to the scientists and engineers in the group, saying any fool could obey orders, only Nelsons can disobey orders. What was wanted was imagination, big conceptions, and quick decisions. Fisher didn't really want to just sit and sift through invention. He wanted to promote something that was going to make a difference. Fisher's address to the BIR is a neat illustration of his style of management and his vision of invention. He had had a great interest in machines of war for a long time and their potentially decisive power in battles. I won't deny that there are some big things that this Board of Invention may bring forth, he wrote to the navalist author Archibald Hurd. Gerald McKenna, one of Fisher's associates, firmly believes that we shall devise some wonderful scheme by which on a button being pressed the whole fabric of the German Empire crumbles into dust. Fisher's image of mechanical war also seemed to leave the complicated processes of invention and research aside. I don't want to be egotistical, he appealed, some would say hopelessly, but there is the stubborn fact that for 6 years between 1904 and 1910, I gave us the navy that has swept the seas, and without undue ignorance, I can say alone I did it. So Fisher was a controversial choice for the BIR, both personally and politically, but no one doubted his zeal that he brought to his managerial position. The Cambridge physicist J.J. Thomson worked closely with Fisher on the Central Committee and was struck by his pronounced personality and extraordinary driving power. His method was that of a mailed fist, he wrote, rather than a gloved hand. In terms of governing invention, this was a stark contrast to what Thomson had encountered in past research establishments in Cambridge. Fisher spent very little time in determining which course should be chosen, and in his choice he seemed to be guided by instinct rather than by reason. When he made his choice, his whole energies were thrown into carrying it into effect. This was a great contrast to the practice I'd been accustomed to in university matters. Now, Fisher had been told by Balfour that the BIR was to screen inventions, but Fisher wanted clarification. In June 1915, Balfour had stated that he didn't want its members to invent. Instead, it would be their business, with the help of departments concerned, to formulate practical demands for new devices. Balfour saw the function of the BIR primarily in terms of advice and coordination. The actual work of research and invention would be left to the existing branches of the Navy and the learned societies. In 1915, the Admiralty controlled or worked in collaboration with a number of experimental stations and national laboratories. Balfour anticipated that for practical experimentation, the BIR would form assignments out to either these stations, while for theoretical considerations, BIR members would work with the various learned bodies with whom they'd be in touch. In these ways, BIR members were expected to manage expectations and guide the Navy through the choppy waters of invention and research. No purpose, Balfour wrote, is served by informing the scientific world that the Admiralty would like very much to be furnished with a sure and easy method of destroying submarines. Nothing productive would be done by making that request, Balfour thought. So this is the initial idea of governance in the BIR. The BIR was to sift through proposals, coordinate invention, and, as throughout the 19th century, leave inventive work to the Navy's operational and civilian officers. So Balfour's guidance was clear, but it wasn't particularly detailed in terms of procedures. It fell far short of being a practical plan for governing invention and research. For example, it was unclear precisely how the members of the BIR would collaborate with other institutions, and how it would assess and coordinate invention and research without a laboratory to do so. The First Lord stated his hope that the BIR would work with the Admiralty departments and groups like the Royal Society's War Committee, but did this mean that BIR members would be required to utilise their personal networks and the goodwill of civilian scientists, or was it up to the BIR to forge institutional links, provide funding? BIR members also raised the issue of commissioning new laboratories in which they would themselves undertake investigations into the proposals they were being sent. So, uneasy with these ambiguities and the tensions that Fisher had between Balfour and the scientific members of the BIR, he asked for further definition. Writing in August 1915, the First Lord restated his vision, but the board would only sift, but it would also promote invention. But instead of prescribing exactly how this would be done, he called on departments within the Navy to inform the BIR of the material problems that they may require solutions to. Quote, "No doubt every department of the Admiralty that deals with material is confronted with problems that have so far baffled solution." An order was issued to the entire fleet that explained that the BIR had been established for this purpose, and that any suggestions for inventions or devices should be submitted to it. Balfour's vision of the BIR as a site of governance relied a lot on the full cooperation of the Navy's technical and operational departments. It also relied on the goodwill of the scientific and engineering communities. Early meetings of the Central Committee revealed that its members struggled to get this goodwill all the time, and so had to make their own equipment and resources available. Charles Parsons, in September 1950, had to offer his own equipment and laboratory to test what was being called a proposal for blinding light using mirrors. Some scientific organisations did offer their support in the case of the Physical Society, which volunteered itself to carry out future research. But the lack of this goodwill in general really served to underline the Admiralty's lack of laboratory space. Late in 1915, the shipbuilding industrialist and philanthropist Alfred Yarrow approached the Admiralty with a plan to establish naval laboratories for physics and for engineering. Yarrow had already endowed numerous scientific and engineering facilities, including a test tank at the National Physical Laboratory for the British shipbuilding industry. He believed that the British government needed to follow the German model for funding academic scientists to work for industry. Yarrow criticised the government for leaving research and invention in the hands of private business, specifically citing the NPL's test tank as a scheme that should have received state funding, but required his philanthropic input. Fisher placed his support behind Yarrow and added his own note in a note up to the First Lord that as a member of the Royal Commission on Oil and Oil Engines, he discovered a real want for engineering research in the Admiralty. The other members of the BIR Central Committee also lent their support to Yarrow's appeal and commissioned its subcommittees to report on the possible benefits of building a naval engineering station and a naval physics experimental station. Members of the BIR Central Committee recognised that a scheme like this might offend those working in the Navy in its experimental stations, so they wanted to emphasise in their proposal documents that the new experimental stations would only work on what they called future schemes, and that their inception was in no way a reflection on what they thought about the Navy's engineering research. The subsequent BIR report noted that Britain spent less on scientific research than Germany and America, and that where the Navy had established experimental stations, it was in gunnery and torpedoes, which only represented a fraction of the issues that a fleet conducting a war at sea would have to deal with in terms of technical concerns. The engineering members of the BIR, such as Dugald Clark, Bertram Hopkins, Charles Mertz, and William Dolby, believed that a central station would be key to successful research in naval work. Dolby recognised that the Navy's establishments would have to be persuaded to let the BIR go in this new direction, and so he went about constructing interest in what these new laboratories could do. He hoped that by presenting the practical tasks that members of the subcommittees undertook, Balfour would see the reasons for making this provision for new laboratories. The BIR's engineering members also asserted that the station should be led by an engineer, or at least a civilian, who would be in direct contact with the Board of Admiralty, but that it should definitely not come under the control of a naval officer. Charles Parsons, who had developed marine turbines for the Navy and the commercial sector, also supported this scheme. He argued that the Royal Navy should not continue to rely on private industry to innovate in its inventions, because then it would only be kind of working on those inventions that would be commercially viable, and there are things that the Navy needs which aren't really commercially viable. Finally, J.J. Thomson argued that the additional experimental stations would be vital to the Royal Navy both in wartime and in peacetime. He also focused on what these stations could do after the war, and I think these kind of concerns with the post-war period really kind of convey that these scientists and engineers were aware that they hadn't been in much demand prior to the war, and that after the war, again, they might not be in much demand. And this was an opportunity to develop science and engineering research in the Admiralty. Now, the lack of government direction and institutionalised support for BIR frustrated its members. For Fisher, this seemed to equate to a personal snub. He began to call the Central Committee the grand jury, and complained to the leader of the opposition, Bonar Law, that he was being put in charge of a chemist's shop. The Admiral came to see the BIR as an outpost that kept him away from actual power. In March 1917, he asked to come back to the Board of Admiralty because he believed he could make more of a difference to the Navy's war material there, but he was turned down. BIR members similarly struggled with their frustrations during this war work. They really struggled to make alliances with the Navy and cooperate with naval officers on their work. The BIR's work on submarine detection is a particularly good example of this. So, J.J. Thomson believed that the technical solution to detecting submarines was reasonably clear. He said that it's well known that sound waves travel well in water, and that a tube with one end closed and fitted with a diaphragm can be lowered into the water to pick up the sound of submarines. The remaining problems in his mind were about distinguishing submarines from ambient noise, and that was one of refinement, practical deployment and training. Vitally, Thomson believed that better results in detecting submarines would be found not by creating a more sensitive device, but by training naval officers to better understand what they were listening for and what they were using. In this work, he collaborated with William Bragg, who in 1916 had been appointed by the BIR to the post of Resident Director of Research at the Admiralty's experimental station at Hawkes Craig. Now, Bragg's team was not the only one at Hawkes Craig. The experimental station there had been built in the early 1915s for the express purpose of developing, testing and training officers in the use of hydrophones. And the station was under the command of a naval officer, Captain C.P. Ryan, who worked to develop the Mark II directional hydrophone and trained over 1,000 officers in its use. From April 1916, Bragg joined Ryan at Hawkes Craig, although Bragg worked in a set of new buildings erected purely for his arrival. From the BIR's view, the two groups of investigators worked independently, and they only received letters from Bragg. They didn't understand or hear anything about what Ryan was up to. Thomson believed that the reason for this lack of coordination was because the anti-Fisher party in the Admiralty had sown distrust in the BIR and Bragg's work. In September 1916, the BIR Submarine Subcommittee visited Hawkes Craig and reported back to the Central Committee with their observations. In turn, the Central Committee reported to the First Lord of the Admiralty that they were concerned by this lack of cooperation, and the First Lord appointed a committee to investigate whether or not the BIR was working. This committee consisted of two civil servants, Alfred Southern Holland and Harry Ross Skinner, and the chemist Alfred Egerton, who had been working closely with Churchill at the Ministry of Munitions. Their report sympathised with the BIR, pointed to the fundamental managerial problems that it suffered, but in the end recommended its absolution. The committee's remit had been to assess whether or not the BIR represented the best way of employing expert knowledge, as the report called it, within the Navy. The report judged that the BIR had been a victim of novelty and an admirable uncertainty over the role of scientists and engineers in governing invention and research. This quote here points to the concerns that Ackworth had had, that the Navy hadn't really had a long history of experimental stations. The committee members visited naval experimental stations and interviewed members of the BIR, and it came to the conclusion that the BIR had done good service in screening inventions, but that its move into governing research and asking for a laboratory was not an effective use of scientific manpower. The final report, abolishing the BIR, the civilian members were adamant that the BIR, if it was to be abolished, the scientific projects that the Admiralty had committed to should remain under the control of a civilian scientist rather than a naval officer. They did get their way, and new infrastructure was put in place, but particularly conclusions C and D represented quite a blow for the scientists in terms of the type of culture of scientific governance that they were trying to bring in their time with the BIR. So the decision in September 1917 to abolish the BIR entailed transferring personnel and ongoing research projects to a new Admiralty office, Scientific Research and Experiment. This branch came under a Director of Naval Research and Experiment, to which Charles Mertz, who I mentioned earlier on, who was an advocate of building new Admiralty research establishments, was appointed. This looked in some ways like a good thing for the BIR, given that Mertz had been a backer of their main concerns, but Mertz's position was unpaid. This would have been very problematic for any academic scientist, but luckily Mertz was a head of quite a profitable consulting electrical engineer firm, so he didn't really need the salary. But this doesn't really suggest that the Admiralty were too concerned by what he was going to be doing in this role. Similarly, at the same time as Balfour did this, he ensured that the Admiralty's anti-submarine work would come under the control of the flag officer. In 1917, the Admiralty placed all its anti-submarine work under a new division, and that was given to the command of Admiral William Wordsworth Fisher, who had a particularly linear view of research and invention, as this note here suggests, where he actually provides, in short, the linear model of research, invention, and manufacture. Fisher and Parsons largely accepted the recommendations of the Commission, but J.J. Thomson and other physicists on the BIR were less pleased. Thomson responded to a report stating his belief quite angrily that the problems in the BIR were those of the Admiralty's making. The weak point is that it is not and never has been, except on paper, regarded as an integral part of the Admiralty. I think the First Lords under whom we have served here so regard it and have done all in their power to get others to do so. But the fact remains that the older scientific departments of the Admiralty regard the BIR as a rival rather than a partner. Thomson wanted, in the BIR's place, to see a standing committee of Admiralty technical officers, scientists and engineers that would, quote, plan campaigns in the application of science for the Navy. In May 1918, BIR members Thomson, Rutherford and Richard Felthall, a demonstrator at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, made MERS a proposal to, quote, make the service of science available for the needs of our Navy. This group of physicists repeated their appeal for a physics experimental station, but this time sought to create interest in how it might work. At the heart of their proposal was a firm distinction between pure and applied science. It is desirable to distinguish carefully between the processes involved in scientific discovery and invention, pure scientific research and discovery supply the principles and necessary data which serve, so to speak, as the raw material for invention. With this, the physicists outlined why they thought the Navy ought to be interested in pure science. That's the bottom quote here, which I'll just skip over. Thomson, Rutherford, and Felthall believed that physical research could be used to suggest new lines of development and invention within industry and within the Navy, once again placing a role on the emphasis of science in governing future technical developments. It was their contention that the edge in future naval supremacy could only be maintained by technical improvements, and that pure science had an important role to play here. So the physicists proposed a site of pure scientific research and instruction to be placed at the heart of the naval establishment, and in which officers would come to scientists to learn more about scientific research and how it could be applied. This scheme worked very well for Thomson and the others and their concerns, but the Navy dismissed it out of hand, stating that it failed to address their concerns. It wasn't clear why the Navy ought to support this type of work. So, to conclude, Thomson et al.'s paper was just one of a number of proposals that circulated through the Admiralty in the months before and after the armistice. Some made suggestions for organising research that were more tailored to the Navy's concerns, but none of them received the Admiralty's support. The Board of Admiralty seemed to want scientific research to be undertaken under the close direction and supervision of naval officers, so to ensure that operational concerns always remained in sight. In terms of infrastructure, the Admiralty did establish a new laboratory in Greenwich, but it was nowhere near the size that Yarrow, Thomson and others had hoped for. They were asking for something much more like the National Physical Laboratory. If we examine the concerns of members of the BIR during the war, it seems clear that they wanted to do more than manage invention, to sift. They wanted to undertake original research work. On the BIR, scientists and engineers had been empowered to work by committee on technical problems, and, in agreement with Fisher, allocated a large amount of public funds to undertake investigations. To do this, they had to establish control over laboratories and experimental stations within the British state. That is to say, they had to gain the power to actively govern invention and research within the state. In this, they were unsuccessful. But the problems that they experienced and encountered on the BIR do help us understand why they placed so much emphasis on establishing a number of large laboratories within the Navy that would be under their control. And if they had done this, this surely would have been a pretty big legacy from the Great War for science. But they did not. In the case of the BIR, whatever ratchet effect there might have been for scientific facilities and research spending was ratcheted back down by 1918. But that shouldn't take away from what I think is the important story to be had here about the BIR, concerning the construction of the scientific, industry, military combinations that would be so important for the history of the early 20th century. BIR members may have ultimately failed to construct interest in their laboratory work and plans for further experimental stations, but the history of the BIR provides insights into the visions for governing invention and research that both politicians and government and members of the scientific community held. War ended in 1918, but these actors continued to campaign for how to organise scientific research in the British state. There's a lot more work, I think, to be done on the BIR in terms of investigating it as a site of patronage and funding for physics and engineering research, in terms of its relationship that it had with its inventors, the reward systems and the way those relationships played out, but also in terms of its institutional legacy in the Navy and in scientific circles. As Dominic mentioned, this is one of my early outings, so hopefully as I get further beyond the Great War, I'll be able to work out just what the BIR's legacy is in these kind of things. But what does seem quite apparent from what I've done so far is that the BIR's legacy is contested quite seriously. So, just to be very brief about this, J.J. Thomson, in his post-war memoirs, writes a lot about what the BIR did and what Bragg did at Hawkes Craig, saying that Bragg was instrumental in Britain's victory in the War at Sea. Admiral John Jellicoe, the commander of the British Navy at Jutland and the First Lord of the Admiralty after Jutland, similarly wrote a post-war history about the anti-submarine war. And in this, he doesn't mention Bragg, but he credits C.P. Ryan with all the credit for winning the war at sea. Thompson does mention Ryan. He calls him something completely different. He calls him Captain Brine, suggesting he doesn't know too much about him, and charges Brine with not knowing anything about the work that Rutherford and others were doing. While Jellicoe goes a step further. He does mention the BIR, he doesn't mention Bragg, but he does accuse the BIR with letting a key invention slip through its hands that had to be sent directly to Hawkes Craig, to Ryan, for the successful hydrophones that were deployed in 1917 to be operational. So there is a legacy to be looked at further when it comes to the BIR. Thank you.